Hey everyone, I'm Nick and welcome back to the channel. If you've been following, you might recognize this car, my 2004 S-Class, which is my daily driver. Well, normally it is, but right now it needs some work. Let me show you what I'm talking about. But on top of that, my AC compressor started making crazy rattling noises, actually bad enough that I didn't want to risk running the engine beyond just driving into the garage. I was already planning on replacing some other parts, so in today's video I'm replacing almost all the engine accessories: the alternator, the power steering pump, the AC compressor, the tensioner, and the idler. So let's get to it. Alright, so because we're going to work on all the accessories on the belt, our first step is going to be to remove the belt. And to do that, we're going to start by removing the fan and fan shroud. Now to do that, it's actually mounted with one 10mm bolt here and another one right here. There's a hose that attaches on top, and right down there there's a connector for the fan. So I've already removed that, and you can actually reach down here. There's two catches to release. You can push down on each side and pull up. It also slots in on the radiator down there, and same thing on the other side. Right there. I'm going to pull it up and out. Right here, there are little metal clips here and here that we're going to want to remove, and they help grab on to keep this in place on the radiator. So you probably want to use a pick and pry it out. And they have little teeth on the edges that'll grab onto the plastic. So I did forget, there's a line right here that mounts to the fan shroud there, and right here as well. So you have to undo those as well before you get this out. And these are Torx bits. To make it easier to remove these, you can take the paneling under the car off and work from the bottom. For reference, we're working on the two screws down at the bottom here and here. Now we can take it out, I think. What's it bumping into this time? Alright, so now our tough part is getting the little ears at the bottom that slotted in past the hoses. So on this side is the big coolant hose, and on this side is the hard line. So let's get that done. Now with that done, it's a little easier to see why we really need to get in here. And one of the big reasons is our AC compressor. It started making a horrible noise. And you can see right here, that's poking out. The fan clutch is messed up. And a little hard to tell, but in the frame right there and on the tray at the bottom, you can't really see it, but there's little metal shavings all over, so not great. Now we're also going to be doing our power steering pump and our alternator. So first thing we're going to do is the alternator. Since we're going to remove the alternator, we want to remove the belt first. And before we do that, let's take a quick look at how it's routed. So it's alternator, idler, power steering, AC compressor, harmonic balancer or crank pulley, tensioner, and water pump. So take a good look and take a picture too. It's good to have a reference. Now to get this off, our tensioner on this car works like this. There's a little stub here, hexagonal stub. On mine it's a 17, and that is what's going to allow us to relieve the tension on the belt and pull it off. And as always, be careful working near a radiator. You want to avoid damaging the radiator. Now it's gonna swing back further, so just be aware of that. Get the belt out. Now this belt's pretty new, so I'm keeping it. Put it out somewhere safe, where it won't get dirty. And now we have access to everything we need. Our alternator mounted in 2 places. Got a bolt right here, and another one right there, and these are E-Torques. So these are E14. And one other thing we have to move out of the way is the coolant bottle. We're not emptying it, we're not disconnecting any hoses. We're just gonna remove this nut, and that will allow us to lift this and move it out of the way, which will give us better access down here, because behind the alternator, which we can access once it's free from its mounts, there's a connector and a cable that we have to disconnect. Like a washer nut combo. Okay, and there's a little tab right here that snaps into the coolant bottle, so we'll be able to move it out of the way when we get to that. Now next I'm gonna release those bolts. With that I should be able to move it over and probably forward to get to the cables on the back. Wow, these are pretty long, huh? So I point out that right here, there's a little holder for this hose that the bolt goes through. So one of the challenges with getting the alternator out is just getting it out of its spot, because this one's been in here for 125,000 miles and 20 years at this point. So I was able to pry the top part out, but I'm gonna have to keep prying to get the bottom part out too. Carefully with the pry bar, we're gonna get in here. There we go. Now what we're gonna need to do here is I'm actually gonna pivot it and have it face down so I can get to the connections on the back. You can see one electrical connector back there with the blue wire. We've got a nut right there. I'm gonna get that electrical connector off. Should angle it back to get the connector off first. And then, okay, yep. Pop that off. And we saw that little metal part went towards the connector. Once you free the alternator and go to pull it up and out, be really careful around the dipstick. Ask me how I know. This is our new alternator. New bolt here. Prep there. Just got a little warning here. It says, hey, make sure your battery's fully charged so you don't damage your alternator. Now let's get this in the car. All right, so we're gonna be much more careful in putting this in. The dipstick is the same across both the pre-facelift and facelift models, so I'll be swapping in the good one off the parts car and we'll be good. But I was able to glue it back on. Then I'm gonna try to bring it down through here. Well, I'll pull this off. There we go, pull that back. Pull that off so it can come down through here. Now we need to put our battery connector on, or our cable. Now our new bolt is a 12. That might depend on what part you get. Got it placed like this. 18 Newton meters. Now that's in place here. Gotta find my little electrical connector right here. Get that on. It only fits one way. There we go. And now we can pivot it back upright and into its slots and put the bolts in. Now these two bolts are 42 Newton meters. And that is the new alternator in place. All plugged in, torqued down. It looks nice. And let's take a look at the old one. You can kind of hear it. The new one's a lot quieter. All right, cool. So next we're going to work on the power steering pump. And that is mounted in a few spots. So first, so you can see the bracket there. There's a E-Torx up at the top and then one actually behind the tensioner. And so to keep the tensioner out of the way, you can see that little hook there. You have to put something in. I have a little circular wrench. So you move it out of the way, you move it to the left until you can pop something in to retain it. And then you'll be able to access that bolt. Now there's two on the front. And then on the back, we have one right here, one right here. And this is also not a mounting bolt, but actually mounts to the ground. So there's a ground wire that runs from here to here. So we'll undo that as well. Now, to reach this bottom bolt right here, in my case, the AC, one of the AC lines is in the way. But if you have a thin wrench, a thin E-Torx wrench, you'll be able to get it in and undo these bolts without disconnecting it. Since I'm servicing the AC compressor next, I'm actually going to undo this, but I've already evacuated the system, so I'm not just venting it into the air. Now there's two lines that connect to the power steering pump. There's one, the return line to the reservoir here, and then there's a high pressure line right here. So I'm gonna have to replace this with a screw type clamp later on, and this one will just screw back in. So I've removed this line. I had to snip this with some cutters and that helped it come loose. And I slid this off and I've clamped it down and blocked off the tip so nothing gets in. And then right here, this is a 17 millimeter and it's a pretty soft metal, so you definitely want to make sure you use a line wrench like this or something similar so that it grabs all the way around and it doesn't round off. So once it's broken free, you can use a wrench. Well, just trying to turn the whole thing, but we'll keep working on it. I might have to hold that while I turn it. All right, so I have it out. And just be aware that before you do any of this, you want to make sure you've drained out as much as possible of the fluid from the reservoir, because otherwise it's going to seep down. You can kind of see some drip down there. I took out as much as I was able to with a syringe type thing. And ideally, if you have a plug, you can just plug this back up and you'll be fine. But right now I just have some towels so I can catch as much as possible. I'll see what I can do. Maybe I can grab the plug off the new pump and put that in there so I don't make too much of a mess. And that is the plug off the new pump. I want to make sure the other one stays clean while I do this. I'll probably take this back out once this assembly is out. I can put it back in while I reassemble it later. Now our next step is going to be to unbolt all this. So again, like I said, I'm going to break that AC line free, move that out of the way. But I highly recommend, if you're just doing the power steering pump, get an E-Torx wrench of the right size, which is E12, to get those bolts out. That way you don't have to mess with the AC system. Now down there, in my case, since I'm doing the line and I'm going to do the AC system, the compressor later anyway, it's a 6 millimeter Allen. So I've broken it free already, so I'm going to keep loosening it. And it's going to hiss. I've already evacuated it, but there's always a little bit of residual pressure in it. Okay, that's out of the way now. So there's a opening there. Now there's room to get those bolts. Oh, this one's long, huh? The one for the ground strap is really short. So for the ground strap, short. The back one is long. I'm gonna guess that the lower one is also a long one. You know, this one's long too. I'm going to remove the 2 front bolts. I'm going to use my long socket. Also a longer one. This one's long too, but it won't come off because there's one more. This here, the tank, the little reservoir, is mounted to the oil filter housing metal. So we got to get this little guy off, and I think this is a smaller size, probably E10. 10. It's 10. That's our small bolt. All right, so this has to come forward because it's kind of hard to see here, but in there, this piece sticks out, so we have to pull this forward. Now the reservoir should come off towards the front. That's coming, it's just wedged in there. Oh, I see. There we go. So not only does this reservoir bolt in, it also slots in. See that little cutout shape? That goes right in here. And fortunately on the 220, we can take it all out as a unit, and that's our power steering pump removed.
With the power steering pump out, we can start preparing to remove the AC compressor, so we're removing the panels under the car to get better access to the compressor mounting bolts. I'm under the car and I've removed the panel up front, which is very useful to undo these screws for this line that tie into the fan shroud, and the panel that covers the oil pan. And you can actually see here, you can get pretty good access for the connectors for the alternator from here. So that's something to consider when you're doing the alternator. Now on the other side over here, we're gonna work on the AC compressor, and you can see 2 of the bolts down here and right here. The other one is further up, it'll be easier to reach it from the top. Being down here should give us at least a better view and a lot better access for this one. So we'll be working down here when it's time to unbolt the compressor.
Now up top, for the AC compressor, the 2 lines are held in by a size 6mm hex head or Allen key. So I've undone those. And you can, with your bolt undone, take that out. They're both a little different. This is a longer one right here for this line, and the bigger line back there is slightly shorter. And you can see there's like a guide pin in there, and there's the same thing on the other one right there. So it'll only fit in one spot, so it'll always be aligned. Now there's also a connector right here, which we can undo. Go, and then there's okay, that wraps around here, so that can stay there. Oh, and right here, this is the 3rd bolt. So we saw the other 2 from the bottom. One thing I realized, I knew there was an issue with the pulley here, because you can kind of see that centerpiece here is kind of out of place. But as you may already have noticed, this is extremely bad, and explains why there's metal shavings down there. So it's a good thing. It's a good thing we're in here to replace this. So the 2 AC lines disconnected, it's time for us to start working on removing the bolts. So those are E12. Oh, look at that. There's right there. There's a bracket that holds this line, and that bracket goes onto this bolt. So something to keep in mind when we reassemble, this will have to go back on it as well. I'm using a little finger ratchet to get more leverage until I can start pulling the bolts out by hand. Maybe you can leave it there. And get underneath and see if I can get the other 2 done. Now once you've broken free your bolts, your E12 bolts, if you need to work in only once they're loose, you could use a 10mm ratcheting wrench to keep working it free, because it's a pretty tight spot. That's out. Get it underneath and do the other one. All right, so all the bolts are out. Some of them are still in place, but we're gonna pull this forward and angle it out. Here goes one of the bolts. Forward, forward, turn. One of my bolts is still in it. Just have to be careful around the radiator. Turn, pull up, and out. Now 2 rear bolts, quite long, like that. And because of space constraints in that bracket, the front one is still here. So, that's good. This is the new AC compressor. And right here, this 12mm bolt is the refrigerant oil port. Now, if your AC compressor comes without refrigerant oil in it, it's, per the manual, 120 milliliters that you would add in. You can double check by pouring this out into a measuring cup, topping it off if needed. And then, yeah, I mean, otherwise it's very similar. It comes with caps on the ports, which is good. So while we're putting it in, nothing's gonna fall in. Let's get this in place. All right, so we're gonna put it in through here and then slot it in there. Just wanna make sure that our connector is up out of the way. It'd be easier to do if the lower front bolt is slotted in before we put it in place, because otherwise there's not really enough room to put it in. So you want to have it on the compressor before you move it into place.
Getting the compressor bolt started can take a little patience, but if you can get a hand to hold the compressor in place, it should help speed things up.
Let's plug in our electrical connector. So with the compressor in place, the torque for each of the E12 Torx bolts is 20 Newton meters. Now for the caps for the AC lines, these are still 6mm Allen heads. There is a possibility these bolts won't be exactly the right length, so I want to double check that. I have kept the bolts that came out just in case, so I'm going to take this one out and compare. Now when you're putting these lines back on, don't forget to put a little bit of refrigerant oil or lubricant on the O-ring before you put it back in. It's also recommended to change the O-rings to make sure you keep a good seal. I'm going to make sure everything's really clean in here before I take that off. A little bit of the oil on it, pop it on. Tightened up, nice. Again, in this case, I'm going to leave the back one off for now because of my tools for the power steering pump. But again, if you have a thin wrench for E-Torx on the back, you'll be just fine. Now, also, something I want to point out is that if while you're working in here you want a little more room, this section of the line can be undone up here, so that if you take this out, you get a little more room. For every component you take out, replace, or anything like that, you have to add a little bit more oil into the system. The connector wiring gets tucked in back here, comes over, and then it'll go up behind the power steering pump and up on top of the engine. So we have a new reservoir and a new pump, but there's one part we need off of the old combo, and that is the circlip right here that we need to pry off and reuse to attach the new reservoir to the new pump. So you can get a screwdriver in there, kind of work it out. Here we go. Now, when you go to put this on, there's a gasket here that we're going to need to use. And you want to be aware that when you pull these caps off, there may be oil inside to keep everything in good shape. Pull that off. glue it on here. That on here. See right there, we want to get it so that that groove right here lines up with the opening in the new reservoir. There you go, wiggle it on, and then slide this through. There we go, that's snapped in. And now we have a single assembly for our new pump and reservoir. Leave this capped off until we connect it. This is still capped off with a high pressure line, and we'll take that out when we go to connect the line. So with our new assembly here, we're gonna bring this down. Now we have to slot our reservoir in. It slides back. Down here, we want to make sure we angle that up into the right spot. Just make sure things are okay back here. We have an E10 for the reservoir bolt. Get that started by hand. There's two slightly different sizes for these. The slightly longer ones I'm putting back in the front, and the shorter ones in the rear. I'm gonna take my short bolt for the ground strap right here. There are two other bolts in. My front bolts going to 20 Newton meters. Do the same thing on the back. I'll make sure I can put my line, my other AC line in, now that the back of the power steering pump's in. Okay, so for the rear one, was a small bolt that came out. So I'm gonna put the small bolt back in because the one that came with it is much longer, and I want this to seal up properly. I gotta pop this cover off. There we go. I'm gonna put this return line here, pop that out. I'm replacing the old permanent one-time use clamp. It's a Jubilee clamp. Just gonna place it here so it's accessible. Slide that on. Can undo my post clamp. I don't think it was an issue. Oh shoot, okay. Oh yeah, I gotta keep this plugged in. Keep this sealed up. This was preventing the high pressure line from leaking, and now it's leaking. Blocking this off really reduces how much leaks out of the high pressure line, so let's keep that blocked for now. This will go here, but I'm gonna put the high pressure line on now. So we got a little cap here we're gonna take off. Gonna make sure our connector's nice and clean. Now there's probably some oil in the pump from shipping. I want to make sure this goes in nice and straight. Use a line wrench. Now it's going good. My pressure line is 40 Newton meters. There we go. Now, pop this out. Put our hose on this up here. Looks good. Now we can undo this. Now before we put our belt back in, if you need to change your idler or your tensioner, it's a good time, especially since we've already locked the tensioner into place. I did these recently, so let's skip back to the past to when I did them. I'll give you some more details. So down here, put my pin in there, you can kind of see. So I'm gonna be able to break out those two bolts. As you can see right here, there's like a little lip, where there's like a little catch, and I put that screw through there. You can see the bolt right there, and the same thing on the top. right here. And those are E12s. You can see right here, that's where the bolt catches the pin. I'll hold it in place so both of the screws or the bolts are accessible. Slot this in. Now these two bolts go to 25 Newton meters. So this is our brand new tensioner with the pin out. It's all torqued in, so I was able to release the pin and put this back in place. And for reference, the tensioner I used is the BBR Automotive 001-30-02302. Replacement number 112-200-0970 from Mercedes. So now we can work on the idler. Oh, listen to that. That is noisy. Actually, let's check this too. Oh, look at that. It doesn't spin. It's like, oh, awful. Now for the tensioner, you see there's a little cap right here? You're gonna wanna work that off. So I got a little hook here. You just reach in. It's probably a little easier to pull that off when the belt's in place, but a little cap here. Should be able to grab it. And that right there is a T50. So just fit in like that. So this is our idler, and this is our bolt. It's pretty long. Our new idler actually comes with a new little cap. So the part I'm using here is, it's called INA 532-0160-100 or FP01601. So this is an M8 bolt, and according to information I was able to find, for an M8 bolt, it's 25 Newton meters, and there are some cars or some engines where this is an M6, and that would be 10 Newton meters. But since this is an M8, which is 8mm diameter at the widest part of the threads, we're gonna go to 25 Newton meters. There's a little shelf right here where the bearing will sit on. There's also the same thing right here, and that's the diameter of this. Pop that on. Fish this in. You're gonna want to go. Don't fall. Get that in place. Get that started by hand. Make sure the idler is centered on the bolt. And that's the new tensioner and idler in. Now since we're putting the belt on normally, I'm gonna take my locking pin out of the tensioner. Maybe that can come back up. Just use a little wrench from a furniture kit like this. Yep. There we go. Make sure everything's centered. Release it. The belt's back in. Okay, now we're gonna put our fan shroud back in. Just check underneath that my tabs are at the bottom in the right place. Yep. Put our clips on, our screws in. Our hose back on. Put our connector back in here. And this harness snaps in there. That is nice and tight. Now we have to reattach this line right here and right here with the T25. Now we can put our intake hoses in. Now our next step will be to bleed the power steering pump.
With the top side back together, I'll put the panels back in underneath.
All right, so it's time to fill the power steering fluid. We're going to be using CHF11S. We're going to fill this up to in the 20 degrees range, but we're going to have to turn the wheels back and forth so we get the fluid circulating through the system. I put this around here so that I don't make a huge mess. All right, can you turn the wheel left and right? We're good. All the way. This is gonna bubble and it's gonna pull the level down. We're gonna top it up. You want to go ahead? Okay.
Still getting bubbles?
I'm hearing some in the system. There's none coming into the reservoir. When there's no more bubbles coming through here, you check the level.
And then we'll run the engine and turn the wheels left and right and make sure the level stays steady.
Yeah. It's nice and quiet. I don't see any leaks either, which is good.
We'll let the engine idle for a minute and then we'll start cycling the steering.
All right, I guess you can start turning the wheel. I think it's good. I think you can shut it off. Let's see our level. Yeah, I'm gonna have to pull some out, but we're good. You can get a syringe, suck some out until we're at in the middle or upper range of the 20 degrees range, so room temperature, and we'll be good. So that's everything back together. It sounds nice and quiet now with all the new parts, which is great. You might have noticed that I haven't refilled the AC system yet, and that's because we're not quite done fixing things. While we've got it up in the air, I'm going to replace the engine mounts, the transmission mount, and a few other driveline components, so watch out for that in an upcoming video. For now, what do you think of that broken compressor? I'm really not sure how that happened. Let me know in the comments if you've seen anything like it before. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like, and if you want to see more on this car or other cheap European cars like my $850 supercharged Range Rover, subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.